There are many reasons why our images can fail, why they can look muddy, why they can lack contrast, why they can just feel as if they don't have a lot of impact. But I think the vast majority of problems come down to one simple thing. And that thing is warm versus cool, the temperature change in the way that we use the contrast inherent in warm colors versus cool colors to increase the vibrancy, the impact, the inherent contrast of our work. The idea of warm versus cool as it relates to color theory is actually a really simple one. It's probably an idea that you can get your head around right now. We use warm and cool to create contrast, but applying it is another matter. This is because warm and cool relates to a lot of different art styles. It really sits at the top of a lot of theory as it relates to picture making. But it's also something that is relative. Fundamentally, what we're talking about here is that one color is always warmer or cooler than another color, but the way that it is warmer and cooler can be through a variety of different ways. It could be more saturated. It could just actually be a different color. A red is going to be warmer than a blue, but you can also have a warm blue and a cool blue, and likewise a warm red and a cool red. So it's important to understand what the idea of temperature means. So often when I was starting out with my art, I would find that things just were lacking vibrancy and impact and contrast. And no matter how much I turned up the brightness and contrast slider in Photoshop, no matter how much I kind of added more detail, it just wasn't having any impact. And I think this is often, I found, down to the fact that I didn't have good warm cool contrast set up from the beginning. So in this video, what I want to do is unpack this concept of warm and cool and give you an idea for what it means at a theory level and also how to apply it. And also I'm going to share with you the very simple frameworks and kind of rules that you can use when it comes to temperature to immediately improve your art and also troubleshoot images that aren't working. A lot of us in the beginning also struggle with just how you actually pick colors and think about, okay, I have one color. How do I pick another color that is warmer or cooler than that color? So we'll go over the basics of that as well. Now, as usual for a Drawing Codex video, this is not going to be fast-paced or heavily edited. This is a real-time tutorial. All this is going to be is me in Photoshop sharing with you some work that I have created in the past and just sort of looking at how we select colors, modify colors, and think about color in Photoshop. This will also go for basically any digital art program though, because they're all very similar. So hopefully that sounds interesting. Hopefully you'll join me. Let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel, we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. If you want to learn more about illustration or picture making, you can check out my free illustration mini workshop. This charts my journey, going from someone who, really wasn't that good at drawing or art to becoming a professional artist, being published. I discuss topics such as how to get more detail and polish in your work, how to think about composition, creating thumbnails for your scenes, as well as a few ideas surrounding how to think about getting professional work. It's free and the link will be in the description, so if that's something you're interested in, go check it out. Okay, before we jump into Photoshop and get started with the practical demo side of this, I do just want to preface this video with a couple of key concepts that I think are important to just make sure we're all on the same page. Now, this idea of color theory and especially temperature, I think is one of the most important things. It's easy to understand, but it also does open the door to the way that illustration theory and picture making theory goes pretty deep. There are many rabbit holes here and concepts where it's easy for me to kind of get sidetracked and start talking about some other aspect of art. For instance, the way that you plan your overall style and the way that you're actually going to make an image can often break down into whether or not you are using color and shape as a dominant contrast in a way to sort of explain what you're creating, or you could often use value and tone and shadow and light and dark and form. you can think of these breaking down roughly into like a tonalist, like a painter, something like your classic Rembrandts, somewhere where you look at it and it feels real. There's a lot of shadows in there. You could look at the way that Monet or an impressionist artist uses color itself as the dominant form of contrast, not value in many cases. You could also look at comic book art, which is a weird hybrid where we have these dark, thick lines, and we also have bright colors as a way to sort of differentiate things. And often comic book art has more or less darks in the inking, and that kind of changes the way that you would actually use color in order to color it effectively. So the way that you construct your entire style and images and the way that you think about what is important to your art and the way you're expressing things does change the way that you will actually interface with a lot of these rules and theories. So what I'm going to do in this video is try and stay super focused on the idea of warm and cool and really try and explain this concept in simple terms and also give you the main takeaways. But it is important to understand that a lot of these things are just rules, and the rules for art are just describing things that people have figured out that work. And I think this can be super useful in the beginning to just know, hey, this is a really simple way to think about constructing your image. For instance, in this video, we're going to talk about warm and cool, receding or coming forward, and the way that you can use that to simply organize an image by putting things you want in focus more in sort of the warm tones. But this is just a guideline, right? And what you'll see is as you look at a lot of other work, and I'll make some follow-up videos sort of, going down some of these rabbit holes and also just looking at some art and trying to explore this concept some more. But there's many ways to make art really look good, and it's important to understand how your style is going to interface with this. But in this video, I can give you some really simple practical advice that will allow you to kind of understand this concept of warm and cool and also figure out how to kind of apply it to hopefully your particular style. But again, these things are both very simple and both very complex, and they interface with a lot of other elements of picture making. So I think it's important to just get that out of the way in the beginning. As a rough overview of what I'm going to do, firstly, I'm going to explain the basic concept of temperature / warm and cool as it relates to, color and how colors can be classified and what that means. Secondly, what I'm going to do is kind of look at the simple rules and frameworks or things that you can actually do to apply this, looking at, again, warm and cool as it relates to how our eye tends to focus and how you can use that to make simple picture plans. And lastly, what I'm going to do is look at kind of how we actually use this, and I'll show you some examples from my work step by step. And again, hopefully throughout all of this, you get a good understanding of how this works and how it can apply to your art. All right, here we are in Photoshop. I have here a variety of different images that I've created over the years, and I'm going to use these to help explain some of these concepts. I also have a couple of other images that I'm going to show you that are more sort of step by step when we look at how we can look at the idea of temperature and warm and cool in terms of process and when you actually might apply this. But these are images that, may be more or less successful than others in terms of color theory and warm and cool, but I think they're going to do well to illustrate some of the concepts that I'm going to talk about. Now, firstly, what I want to do is just go over the basics of color when we're kind of picking it and manipulating it in a digital art program like Photoshop, but these concepts are going to be applicable to whatever program you're using. I like to use a traditional metaphor and way of looking at and thinking about picking and mixing and changing colors. There's many other ways to look at this, but I like to use the hue, saturation, and balance sliders. Also, we have a color wheel, and these help us to conceptualize and understand what color we've picked and where it is, and they also give us some different options and ways to manipulate and change the color. So a lot of what we do, especially when we're dealing with warm and cool, is we are picking a color, right? So I'm going to pick a red, and then I'm going to use the tools to say, well, let me make this cooler, and I'm going to adjust the color thusly. So let's look at kind of how we would do that. What's going on and how do I think about, okay, I've got one color here. How do I then sort of change it? Again, I'll go into this in a little bit more detail right at the end to really sort of nail down how we might think about this. But here we have hue, saturation, and balance. And this essentially relates to the hue, the saturation, and the balance, or the black. Now, the hue is a good metaphor and way to think about the hue is that the hue is kind of the tube of paint, right? So if I increase the saturation and the sort of balance all the way, I'm getting a really pure out of the tube red. Likewise, I could have a very out of the tube sort of yellowy orange, right? A yellow, a blue, pink, etc. Right? So think of the hue as this is the paint that comes out of the tube when you have a tube of paint that's very, very bright, where you're kind of primary, primal sort of main sets of colors. These are just super bright. That's the best way to think of the hue. Like, what actual color is it? Now, the saturation is really talking to the vibrancy, the intensity of the color. A good way to metaphorically think about this is that the less saturation we have, so if I go and pick that red, and all I'm doing is Alt-I swaps to eyedropper. There's a variety of ways you can do this. In Procreate, you kind of like press and hold. A lot of sort of, tablet apps, you sort of press and hold, and you can sort of select the color. Then we can manipulate it. So I'm selecting the red. And if I mix more sort of white into it by reducing the saturation, that's kind of what's happening. So you can think of increasing the saturation as just saying, I've just squeezed out the tube of bright color. And if I decrease the saturation, kind of what I'm doing is mixing white in with it. All right, so you can see we get more of these pastel colors as I introduce more or less white into it. And you can see this on the color wheel. The color wheel is just as good for changing colors. You can change the colors with the HSB sliders or a color wheel. The color wheel is good for understanding and conceptually thinking about what is happening to the color as you change it. So you can see what's happening on the triangle is that as I move towards the white, we're going up towards this corner of that triangle, and this gives us basically a pure white. So if I go all the way to that triangle, I've got white, and if I go all the way to that triangle down the bottom, I've got black, and if I go halfway, I've got gray, and if we kind of go in the middle, I've got sort of like a muddy neutral red. And what this is doing is just sort of mixing different levels of white and black into it. So if we go back to thinking about the white tube, again, no white is full saturation. A lot of white mixed in with it is sort of low saturation. The saturation modifies the intensity of the color. Now the B, all right, the black or the balance is where we essentially are mixing black in with it. So if I take my super saturated red and I reduce the sort of balance, or I sort of move it more towards the dark, right, what I get is a darker version of that red, right? So that's a good way to kind of think about it. We've got the main primary color that we're sort of picking, and as we put more white or we reduce the saturation, we get more of these pastel colors. As we increase the black, right, or sort of adjust the balance, then we get these darker but still saturated versions. Now obviously what normally happens is you're selecting a combination of different levels of saturation and brightness. So I could also have a version of this red here that has, sort of maybe 50% saturation, let's say. And that's kind of typically how I like to think about it, is in the percentages, but that's, I kind of started doing digital art that way. And I can also mix some black into it. And what you tend to find is that as I'm mixing black and white into it, you're kind of mixing gray into it. Because if we take all the saturation out, and then we just essentially mix black with white, you get a gray. So again, if I say, okay, I've taken all the saturation out, it doesn't matter what the hue is, right? They're all white, right? So you can see that I've got a bit of saturation. This is giving me sort of different versions of that. But if we take all the saturation out, you can see we go all the way to the top of the triangle. It's just white, right? okay, now if I mix black into that, or I change the balance slider, essentially now I'm just mixing black into the white, and so I get these kind of grays. And a good way to think about it, you can see what's kind of happening there with the slider is we're just running along that edge. We've got no saturation in there. Now, if I kind of pick, again, let's pick a, neutral gray, right, 60% gray, and then I mix a bit of that sort of hue into it, right, increase the saturation. You can see I'm starting to get a sort of gray with a little bit of color mixed into it, right? And as we increase the saturation, I am getting more, sort of a more vibrant color. All right, so that's a good sort of rough explanation of how you might actually use these sliders. But next, we need to think about what is a warm or a cool color. Now, this is where it can get complicated, and a lot of this has to do with, quite frankly, the relative nature of our perceptual systems. It's hard to say whether your blue that you see is the same as my blue, and it's easy to go down the rabbit hole of relativity when it comes to color and wavelengths of light and why this happens and why that happens. So again, I'm going to try and keep it simple and direct, although again, for me, I'm still probably going to make it more complicated than you might like. But it's important to look at, okay, these are names that we're giving to particular colors. So there's a couple of ways you can essentially do this. You can adjust the hue, because some hues are warmer and cooler than others. You can also increase or decrease the saturation, and that will affect the warmth of the color, and to a certain degree the amount of black that you sort of move into it, and the way that you kind of adjust the grays will also change the way that it looks relative to other colors. And that's really important to understand, is this is all a matter of how our perceptual system categorizes the color relative to another one. So for instance, I can have a red here, and then I can choose a sort of cooler version of that red, right? And these are much sort of cooler, right? Less sort of saturated versions. But this is the classic, color is all relative. If I do take, right, one of these colors and I put it over there next to a blue, it's going to appear a lot more vibrant, right? Because it is warmer or cooler than the color it's next to. So, this color is maybe going to, appear a lot sort of cooler than this one. But, if we sort of pick this is the classic sort of color relativity example that people give, right? If I sort of put this color on here, suddenly it's going to appear a little bit warmer and, sort of also brighter. So we're also painting all of this on a white background, which is also going to affect the way that you view the colors. So the bottom line is that what we're talking about here is a way we're using words to categorize the way that light affects your brain, going through the retina, getting messed up inside your head, and then we're trying to sort of get some consensus reality on this. That's just one way of looking at it. But fundamentally, we do often perceive some colors to be warmer or cooler than others. And often it kind of breaks down sort of half-half on the color wheel. You can look at essentially normally all of the colors, sort of the greens, the blues, the darker blues, the kind of purples, right? The cooler purples, these over here, right, are going to be cooler, right? So if we sort of look at those, yeah, normally you're going to have, let's increase the saturation, right? We got a green, right? We got a blue, right? We got a more blue, right? We got that sort of dark blue, right? Then you might kind of have this kind of purpley blue, and these are all going to be in most cases, again, a pink is like a cool red, right? Gonna have an orangey color here, right? Boom, yellow, right? And then maybe again we sort of come full circle, and we've got a sort of a warm green versus a cool green. So as a baseline, this is a good way to think about it. Is this sort of side of the color wheel is cool, and this side of the color wheel is warm. And this is all relative though, because we can have, right? I can have a blue here. So again, the first way to sort of categorize color is by the hue, by the tube of paint. Is it a warm color or a cool color in terms of just the pure hue? But also I could take my red and I could take my blue, and you could say, okay, we definitely have a cool blue and a warm red, but I can create very cool versions of that red. And I can also create very sort of cool or less saturated versions of that blue. So there is an element to where vibrancy of the color, because a lot of what we're talking about here as it relates to art, and this is where there's practical art advice, and then there's color theory from a science perspective. And I think the science can really help us to understand things, but also we have to look at the practical way that we actually use color and the effect it has. And there's a certain degree to where a big part of what we're talking about as it relates to warm and cool is looking at colors that are kind of coming forward and seeming more vibrant versus colors that are sort of receding and feeling a little bit cool. Because again, warm colors will come forward, cool colors will recede. So why are these two ways that we can modify the temperature important? A lot of this comes down to the way that you may be working with a very limited palette in the beginning. You may not have the ability to create a lot of contrast with different hues. Often, a lot of art, especially tonalist art, requires that you create a lot of the cooler colors with grays. And a lot of this comes back to traditional art and the way that color mixing was used and limited palettes, and how that is a really effective way to focus more on the light and dark and the tonalist nature of the image. But either way, typically what you're going to be thinking of is, okay, I have a color. How do I make it warmer or cooler? And sometimes we can do this by actually changing the hue. Sometimes we can do this by getting more into the grays and sort of taking saturation out of it, moving it more towards, again, sort of a warmer or a cooler gray. And that's going to give us that color vibrancy. The point here is that you could have a sort of very bright color, and you could still, you could have a color a cover that's completely monotone, an image that's completely monotone, right? This would be a good example. But there are different types of yellow in here, and even though if we look at the background here, it's still a very red color, it feels much less saturated than this sort of full saturation color in the foreground. So often what we're having to deal with is a relativity of color, and this is where you're thinking about, okay, how do I modify this color to make it cooler or warmer? And you often have different options. You can change the hue, you can modify the saturation. Also, in some ways, the balance, the amount of black that you mix in is going to affect the sort of feeling of vibrancy and the way that that color relates to others. And often, again, what you really spend a lot of time doing, especially with more painted styles, is working with the grays. You spend a lot of time modifying cool grays versus warm grays, and these could be grays that have a little bit of tint to them, right? So you could be working on a green image, and a lot of what you're doing is dealing with warm and cool, very, very dark, desaturated greens in the background. But your ability to change and modify and tweak those and create contrast through the temperature is what will elevate your work. So color is not always just a matter of, oh, I've got a bright blue, a bright green. Often color is very, very closely looking at the temperature and thinking about how do you subtly increase the feeling of contrast through color so that you can get contrast there without really sort of having to dial up the value or the color too much. If you think about the temperature, it's a really effective way to manage contrast in your scene. So those are the basics of what we're looking at when it comes to color theory. We've got the hues, they're all different colors. You've got the sort of tube of paint. We've got the concept of saturation, or how much white is mixed into that, versus the balance or the black, how much black is mixed into that. And obviously when you mix a bit of white and a bit of black, you get gray, a gray sort of tone of that particular color. And The next thing to think about is that adjusting that sort of gray and mixing more or less gray into a color will affect its sort of feeling of warmth and the temperature there. And so even if you're just working with one or two colors, if you start working in grays and potentially, sort of warm grays and cool grays, you can get a lot of contrast in there. The eye will pick it up. So this is the key, is the eye will pick it up because we pick up the temperature shift, but you won't have this kind of overwhelming feeling of like, blah, there's all this sort of contrast coming at you. And that's often what we want to create the subtlety that we need. Often in the beginning, we're trying to create subtlety. We don't want everything to be sort of super high contrast, but often our work lacks that sort of impact. So temperature is frequently the way that you actually get that done. The key here is to understand that fundamentally what you're always dealing with is a relativity. You frequently have a color that is already part of the color scheme or something you've already put down, and you're thinking about how do I create a color that is relative to that. So this is where you kind of have to at the same time understand that yes, you can change the hue, you can change the color, but you also need to understand that it's all relative. And if you're sort of messing around here in the grays, that often, you can get quite a lot of contrast to happen just by subtly sort of shifting and moving around the temperature. And, if you sort of mix this in with adjusting the actual hue as well, you can get this kind of symphony of gray tones that, feel very, toned down, as I said, but, still have a lot of impact. It's worth mentioning that this idea of contrast can be related to different elements within an image. So you can think about it from a compositional standpoint. I have this thing in the foreground and all of this is warm and cool versus this thing in the background is, warm or cool in contrast to the foreground or whatever. But this also relates to creating contrast across the form. So if you're painting, another good sort of really easy rule of thumb is that you want to have warm highlights and cool shadows or vice versa. So increasing the contrast in temperature across form is a really good way to increase the perceived contrast, again, without having to dial up the actual values. But the bottom line is you can think about this from a larger compositional standpoint, or just even on a very, very subtle rendering standpoint. All right, with that out of the way, what I'm going to do now is look at some of these frameworks or systems or basic ideas that really work. Now, there's three that I think are really useful, and these are all things that I've actually mentioned. So let's go over them briefly, then I'll unpack them a little bit more, then we'll jump into Photoshop and I'll kind of show you what I mean. The first thing is that we want to work warm and cool contrast into our lit side of the form versus the shadow side of the form. So you can think of this as an arm, right? You've got one side of your arm is lit, the other is in shadow. You have light and shadow, and that defines form. It's good to have a difference of temperature between those two. It's also good to make sure that that temperature difference is mirrored everywhere in your scene, i.e., all of the light sides of forms, all of the light in your scene is either warm or cool, and that your shadow is, opposing that. So if you have a lot of cool highlights, cool light sides of your form, then you kind of have warm shadows, and vice versa. If you have a lot of sort of bright, warm highlights and lit side of the form, you want to have cool shadows. And again, this is a super simple rule. It applies to pretty much kind of everything, and it just tends to give you more contrast, again, without having to dial up the value. This is especially useful if you're dealing with more abstract comic book styles where you don't necessarily want to render everything, but you still want to delineate form. A lot of manga, anime sort of styles use this. A lot of comic book coloring uses this. I have a lit side and a shadow side of the form, but it's not that there's a huge value contrast. The shadow isn't black, but it is a different color, often a different hue, slightly different saturation, and there often is a temperature differential between those two, and that's often how we get contrast in one side of the form versus another, without creating a lot of sort of value contrast and making things really sort of dark versus light. The second rule / framework that I think is really useful is just that, as I said, warm colors come forward, cool colors recede. Now, let's unpack that a little bit, because I think often it's hard to know what these words mean. Again, often these are words we're using to try and describe the way that your retina and your brain perceives the world, which is tricky. we're not on solid ground here, but I think where you are on solid ground is understanding that your eye is typically going to be drawn to the warm colors in an image versus the cool colors, and that you can manipulate the way that the eye is going to be drawn to those sort of warmer colors. Now, there's a couple of ways we can sort of unpack this, but that's basically the simple rule. And typically the problem happens when we're kind of opposing that, right? Where you're sort of accidentally creating something where the thing that you actually want everyone to look at is really sort of cool, and you have on accident some sort of warm, bright, sort of vibrant colors somewhere else in the image that are kind of drawing the eye. You're kind of cutting against the way that our brain is typically going to perceive the world. The last idea here is just, and this is a bit of a weird one, is that people just tend to like warm colors, warm color schemes, warm things. We're drawn to warmth. We will tend to feel that the warmth is more appealing. Now, you may not always want appeal in your image. You may want something to feel a little bit or whatever, but on a global level, this is often one of these things that gets talked about when it comes to like marketing. You want the cover to be warm, right? Because warm colors sell more. People like them. They're drawn to them more. You can take this with a grain of salt or not. I think linked to some of the other things that we've talked about here, you could be, and this is where I'll sort of lead into unpacking some of these a little bit more. You can sort of start to get lost in the weeds in terms of like, why is this happening? Or, what's the rationale? What's the science behind this? I think it's worthwhile just understanding that often, these rules have been pretty well tested. They will tend to hold up. Similar to another sort of good comic book cover rule that I sort of heard was passed down from editor to editor, is that you want more triangles on a cover, right? More diagonals and make it look more dynamic, right? And that's kind of just what they see. There's like not enough triangles here, right? It's not warm enough. Just make it warm, put triangles in there, and then more people will buy it and will make more money. It's very reductive, but often there's wisdom to this. So the question is like, why? And I think fundamentally as artists, we don't need to question why, but many people have said many things. And I think we can look at how maybe some of that science relates to these ideas, if that's something you're interested in. But, at the bottom line is that just kind of works. So it has been sort of said that, our eye is drawn to warm colors because, and I've heard this said, from a biological point of view, I don't know whether this still tracks or sort of holds up, but that a lot of the red and sort of really sort of warm receptors are very sort of tightly packed at the back of your eye. And so when those wavelengths of light hit there, the receptors are very close, so you feel it very strongly. And that's why you kind of look at bright red and it's like, whoa, that's very impactful. It's very exciting because it's physically kind of doing a lot of impact on your eye. I have no idea whether that's true. It's just one of those things I kind of heard over the years. The other thing people have said is this is linked to evolutionary psychology, right? You have your sort of early hominids wandering in their hunter-gatherer sort of groups, and people are looking for berries, and the berries are all kind of like little red berries or little bits of fruit that are often brighter, and you're in a sea of sort of blue sky and cool sort of green forests and stuff, and we're always drawn to that. And things like blood are red, so we're worried about it, and things like fire are red, so we're always more worried, more excited by fire. We pay more attention to that. Who knows, right? It really doesn't matter. The bottom line is that this just tends to be the way things work. Now, there are a couple of things that I think are quite sort of logical as it relates to both the depth perception of color, i.e., more saturated, brighter, warmer colors coming forward, is that there is a way that the world and our understanding of the Earth tends to break down that way. When we're looking into the distance, we often do have more atmospheric perspective. Often there is a lot of sort of blue atmosphere that kind of tends to sort of be a part of that. So things in the distance will move towards the neutral. They will kind of tend to move a little bit sort of more blue, and you can sort of accentuate that and really get that feeling of sort of stuff receding into the distance. Things up close tend to be things that we're looking at more. We can see there's more sort of brighter lights. Again, they're sort of less neutral. So there's a way that the depth plays in, but it's also important to understand that the way we're actually perceiving things means that just warm colors are going to draw more of our eye. So you don't have to follow any sort of depth logic to this, although if you do, and kind of just make your backgrounds blue and cooler and your foreground sort of warmer and more sort of red, that will always work. It's one of these things that like if you do that, the image is going to work, people are going to be interested in it, they're going to understand it a lot better. But the bottom line is, yeah, you can have something that is cool in the sort of foreground because you don't want people to look at it, and you have something warm in the midground because that's where you want people to look, or you could have something really sort of warm in the background because that's where you want people to look. So you can kind of manipulate this. This is where art sort of rises above a lot of these other concepts, because we can manipulate the way our illustrations and images look to work with how the brain perceives things, and we can sort of tweak and change things a bit. So the bottom line is, again, you just need to understand that the warm, bright colors are the things where you're going to look, and the cooler, sort of less saturated colors are where your eye is going to tend to pay less attention. The way that the physics of rendering and lighting will affect the idea of warm versus cool highlights and shadows, though, I think it does have a lot to do with the way that lighting is typically set up. So for instance, often the kind of default setting, and the thing that will tend to feel a little bit more natural, is that the light side of the form is warm and the shadow side is cool. This is kind of linked to our general sort of outdoor environment sort of understanding of how lighting tends to work. You tend to have the sun, which is actually kind of a neutral sort of light, but when you contrast it with cool shadows, it appears very warm. And the reason the shadows are often cool is that when you have a form that doesn't have any light on it, there's no light. It should be black, but it's not black because you have ambient light, ambient fill light. Outside, where does the majority of the ambient fill light come from? It comes from the overall environment, and often things are bouncing blue, cool light sort of coming off the sky, which is blue. So often, especially the upper sort of forms of things that are in shadow are just receiving bounce light from the sky, and basically everything that's in shadow is just getting that sort of fill bounce light, which tends to be cool in relation to the light of the sun. So again, it's all relative, even though, you know, the sunlight is kind of a neutral light, right? Relative to everything else, it's going to be very different. You can really see this emphasized in snow, where there's a blue sky, where the shadows will be quite blue, because again, there's a lot of reflection going on there. Anyway, that moves much more towards the theories of rendering and shading and stuff, but often what you have is you have a light source, and you have a lot of fill light that is kind of filling up the shadows in a particular scene. And often, again, if there is a good contrast between warm and cool there, that is something you want to play up. But generally, there just will be contrast where the light is going to be warmer or cooler than the shadows and the fill light in the scene. And, you know, this is all going to be changed depending on the lighting scenario. For instance, if you have sort of an indoor lighting scenario where everything's lit by warm firelight, there's not going to be a lot of sort of ambient light that's not from that fire. It's just light bouncing around the room from the warm fire, so a lot of that fill light is going to be warm, and that's why often if you are trying to represent that real sort of warm indoor firelight, kind of everything is going to be warm. And again, we could go down the rabbit hole of sort of talking about this, but there is a lot of sort of logic behind, from a rendering and sort of scientific wavelengths of light perspective, why you would want to have warm versus cool sort of highlights and shadows when you're actually rendering things. That does relate directly back to how, you know, we tend to sort of perceive the world. Okay, let's jump back into Photoshop here, and I'll talk about some of those things, and we'll just look at some examples. Now, there's a couple of things here that I want to sort of cover in this last section, and a lot of this relates to how we actually use this and how you might actually use these ideas. So there's obviously the main thing you can do is think about this theory of warm and cool as you plan the image, and think about how the image works and how you're going to use warm and cool to help yourself. Now, a lot of this comes down to what type of mood you want in the image, and how, whether or not you're going to utilize a lot of sort of pure color here, right? What we're talking about here, or whether you're going to use the relativity between different essential versions of the same color. So if you're planning an image, this is often what you want to do. And a lot of this comes down to the project you're working on, the style, the feel. How you use color is going to be very specific to you, the way that your style works, again, your feelings, your emotions, all of that stuff. You don't need to, and people typically don't work in, you know, a huge variety of different styles of color. People typically have a really good sort of way of understanding the world. And again, they use color in a particular way. So for instance, here we have a panel from Pinocchio, my Pinocchio comic. Now, I know that in this book, I want things to be vibrant. I want things to be colorful. I know that I have in this particular scene a orange fox character. He's going to be in the foreground because that's a very bright color. I know that I can actually put quite bright greens in the background, because even though they are still vibrant and they're going to draw a lot of attention, I know that the warm color is going to pull the eye more. So if you're thinking about this often, and this is one of the things I say about color theory in general, part of it is you looking at an image, and I'll show you some process from some of these images that I've created in a little bit, so you can see the second thing here, which is like developing a check-in, so that as you're working on an image, how do you actually modify things based on the warm and cool temperature, especially things looking muddy. But there's ways where you would, throughout the process of the image, think about how do I increase the contrast here using warm and cool, but also from a set dressing standpoint, from thinking about the conceptual idea of an image, i.e. I am creating a comic book where I have this orange fox and they're walking through a forest, and you understand that that's inherently an interesting color scheme and that will work. And if you're in control of a lot of these different things, you can just create scenarios where there is going to be naturally a good warm and cool color contrast anyway. And that will tend to give you pretty good results. So when you're planning an image, there's a variety of ways that this can be applied. Now, the other thing I sort of want to start to unpack is that the bottom line here is just that the warm and cool contrast will excite the eye. The other thing I've heard from a biology point of view is that the sort of warm, like the red receptors for white light wavelength in your eye are sort of separate to the blue ones or the cool ones. So the red ones and the blue ones are sort of in different spots. So when you're kind of bouncing between them, it creates kind of more excitement from a biological point of view. Again, you can ask, like, is that why is that? Like, who knows, right? But either way, the bottom line here, right, the fundamental thing we need to understand is that having these sort of bright changes between warm and cool will create visual interest. It makes it look interesting. So, for instance, here I have a comic book page, and what I've done is try and play up in the planning stage the difference between the characters being outside in the cold and then being inside in the warm, sort of inviting environment, and playing up the oranges versus the sort of blues and the teals here gives me not a lot of contrast within the scene, but in a comic book, often what you're after is just visual interest on the page. So as you sort of flip from page to page, right, you see this, and boom, there's a lot of visual interest because I have that big color temperature difference. And this is specific to this particular page, right? Because it has a transition from outside to inside. So this is often where you can think about, from a planning standpoint, how do I dial that up? And again, that's what I've done. So the interesting thing here is that if you were to zoom up, right? So if we zoom up and we just look here, I'm actually sort of going against one of the ideas that I think is really important, which is that you should have a cool background. Here I've got a bright yellow background, and a lot of the stuff in the foreground is, relatively speaking, a lot cooler. I've just got grays and muddiness. But again, it gives us this feeling of being sort of warm. So if we were to just kind of have a whole page like this, it might not be kind of as exciting, because it would feel maybe a little bit too monotone, a little bit sort of dull. It's still very exciting, but again, that's because I have a pretty good sort of handle on the color, and this kind of works. And also, if you look at the kind of what's happening here, right, it is this thing where the fox is kind of being sneaky, right, and it is this kind of almost dangerous scenario that Pinocchio's in. So it's a mix of it being warm and inviting, but also dangerous, and looking at that basic concept that when you are inside and it's sort of lit, as I said, with candlelight, you're not going to see a lot of warm and cool sort of shadow differential. So I'm just trying to sort of lean into that idea. In a similar way here, we have an overcast night shot. Again, you don't get a big sort of warm, cool contrast there. So I'm trying to lean into this, and I made it interesting by making a change between the actual panels themselves. But as I said, probably if you just had them all blue like this, right, even though there's a lot of contrast here, right, it's kind of working. I've got value contrast between the tree and the thing and all that. Yeah, the bottom line is that the reason this is more vibrant is because I've got these two colors there that's giving us this sort of pop there. So similar idea here, but I'm going from a more sort of miserable, like toned down gray feeling to this kind of exciting, more sort of dangerous thing where he kind of meets the snake. And I still have some sort of warm, cool contrast with the shadows, right? You can see often on Pinocchio here, right? If I sort of look at the shadow differential, right? Things are getting a little bit cooler in the shadows, right? But yeah, just very sort of basic color theory, and that's one of the things I'm sort of looking at. So here we go from a lot of the sort of bright yellows, and we're transitioning from these sort of much cooler with a few bits of red, right? But this feels a lot more sort of muddy and low saturation, even though it is sort of warm. This feels very sort of impactful, and it's that contrast between those two that gives the page more vibrancy. Again, if it was all green, it would still feel vibrant, but it wouldn't have that sort of impact and interest. So anyway, I'm just sort of talking you through some of the ways that I use these ideas of warm and cool from a planning standpoint. So here we got another one. This is a concept art piece for a video game. And the goal here is to describe a scenario where they're in this kind of wasteland. And this wasteland is, full of this pollution and, this kind of infected spores and stuff. And the goal there is you want this to feel miserable and gray and like there's sort of no hope and that this is infected and gross, but you still need to have contrast, and the game style needed to have some color. So we're looking at how you would introduce color in a scenario like that, where you essentially have a monochromatic image. And the way that I do that is simple. We have, as I said, essentially a monochromatic image. Now, how do we look at images and assess them? This is something that you can do just by getting the eyedropper out in Photoshop and just sort of scrolling it across an image. And what you're looking for is where are all the colors on either the color wheel or the sliders. So the solution here that I have is essentially just to use the temperature of a lot of sort of warm reds, essentially oranges, and I'm just moving between sort of gray versions of those and higher saturation versions of those. And you guessed it, the sort of higher saturation, warmer versions of those reds are in the foreground. They come forward. The things in the background, right? They're very desaturated grays. But again, going back to what I was talking about, you can kind of look at an image and just kind of, if I just scroll everywhere, you can kind of obviously see the change in the color wheel that comes up when I hit the eyedropper there, right? But also pay attention to this. Pay attention to the way these sliders are working. Pay attention to the hue, the saturation, and the balance, or you can pay attention to where this little dot is on the triangle. Now, again, that may be, I apologize, that may be hard to see if you're kind of looking at this on a particular screen, but I'll sort of describe what's going on. So as I kind of go throughout this whole image, what I'm seeing is that the hue doesn't change that much. It's kind of going here, right, from sort of reddy orange to yellowy orange, and that's really where it's sitting. I do have a couple here that are kind of red, but again, they're still in that orangey red, right? They're not even at the far end of that slider, right? So if I look at here, essentially we're sort of vibrating around here on the color wheel, right? And it's going to be the same over here, right? And back here, yeah, it's a little bit different, but all that's happening is we're sort of moving to vibrate over here, right? And we're moving a little bit yellow. So I'm moving towards the yellow in the cooler colors, and I'm decreasing the saturation. I'm moving a bit more towards the red, and I'm increasing the saturation in the foreground and the elements where we want it to sort of come forward. I'm just using that very simple plan. So this is more of a tonalist sort of image, and again, this is going to get a little bit off track, but I'll just sort of go a little bit down that rabbit hole and sort of duck out. this does relate to the way that we construct images. So this is more of a tonalist image. And if I select this and go Control-Shift-U, that's going to just desaturate the image. And you can see it's still there. I can still tell what's going on. So I'm kind of leaning into a monochromatic image. In order to lean into a monochromatic image, you kind of have to do one of two things. You have to have a lot of color contrast, right? A lot of vibrancy, or you need to make it work from a tonalist perspective. So this one works from a tonalist perspective, i.e. we take out the color, it still works. Now let's look at this one, because this is actually a similar idea from a color standpoint, right? If I sort of look here, right, it's actually staying the same place on the hue. All right, so if we look at where this slider is on the on the color wheel, it's going here. You can see if I sort of go around this image, right, it's kind of staying there. Even if I go to these kind of pinks, it's like, yeah, it's sort of going over to pink, but pink is probably the only way that it's really sort of deviating. And I have these sort of yellows. So we're going basically from orange all the way to maybe like a very sort of warm pink. Same thing here, right? If I look at the color temperature, it's a little bit more towards the yellows, but it's basically the same hue. So you can think of this as I'm using the same tube of paint for these. I got a red, maybe I've got a cool red, right? A little bit of a pinky red, and I've got a, sort of orange and maybe a yellow, right? And those are the colors I'm using. And the rest is just a matter of how much black and how much white do I mix in with those. Now, this image, though, is vibrating slightly differently. So I've still got some warm and cool contrast here, but not that much. There's not that much warm and cool contrast in this image. But I do have a lot of saturation. So here, I'm right at the edge of this. We're right at full saturation, full brightness. If we look at the background, right, we have the same thing. It's a darker, it's still pretty bright. Right, here we've got some, sort of grays. But essentially, this is just a very bright color. So the reason that this cover may work from an image point of view is that people like warm colors come forward. Less so from the image perspective, but more so probably relative to what's around it. So I feel like it probably would work as a cover. The other thing is that we do have some simple value contrast between the character's face and the environment. So it is very much working less on a color temperature standpoint and more just a little bit on a monochromatic tonalist perspective. But I had to put a lot more color into this to make it look interesting, because if we go to this image and we take the color out, it basically turns into nothing, right? But this gives you a good idea of how we're generally perceiving the image, which is to say that mostly what we're focusing on is the character's face, and everything else is just a sort of a gray color, a gray tone, but it's very, very saturated, very bright. So you can see that again, it has a lot of impact when the color's on, and it has no impact almost when the color is off. And this is very much based on the dominant contrast of the image is one of color vibrancy, right? And again, it's a monochromatic, very simple image. If we look at this one, right, and I turn off the color here, right, it's going to be almost the same. If I turn off the color here, this one is going to almost turn into nothing. And a lot of that is to do with the feeling I want, and trying to sort of express different kind of things. But I feel like this one probably could do with more contrast overall, right? And increasing the temperature contrast may sort of help it. But because we're going down that rabbit hole a little bit, there's probably a couple of things there that probably aren't fully explained, because a lot of this comes down to illustration, sort of picture making theory, tonalism versus sort of no-tan, sort of flat color versus sort of impressionism. There's lots of different ways to create images, different ways to make them look good. As I said here, this is directly going against all of the rules that I kind of said. Warm colors in the background, but it kind of works for the scene, and because it's on a page, there's still color vibrancy. So again, a lot of this comes down to how we think about planning the image, and in many cases, though, what's more important is that I am sort of getting partway through an image and I'm tweaking it based on my understanding of warm and cool. So hopefully that gives you an idea for how you can plan I will do some follow-up videos, so stick around for those. Subscribe if you want to sort of hang out, where I'll kind of go into that in more detail, looking at how I created some of my other images, and I might do a few sort of demos as well, looking at, okay, like how do we actually kind of step through this process? Because again, I think this is such an important thing. I think it can really help. So again, I just want to sort of share as much of this as I can. But what I want to do now is look at the second thing, which is, how do you kind of check an image? Because I think often what happens is we're working on it. It doesn't have enough color contrast. We want to add more, but the question is kind of how do we do that? So I'll just show you some examples where I've done exactly that. Okay, let's take a look at this image, which was on that page, but here I can show you the steps. Now, this is going to talk to the way that often what we want to do is check as we create our image and make sure that we are optimizing the warm and cool contrast. So for this one, I had a little thumbnail. So we'll just kind of step through the process quickly, and then I'll sort of go back and we'll sort of talk through the steps. We have a thumbnail here. That's a fairly rough thumbnail. What I did after that was create a more finished drawing. This is still super rough, but this is to go underneath the concept painting. So it's just rough. It doesn't need to be super detailed. Next, I did a color block in, and the idea here was that this character was going to be a bit ethereal, almost like a genie from a bottle, and this was kind of a character that is more like a sort of like a training fighting partner or something like that. Anyway, so that's why they're blue, right? Not necessarily meant to be fully corporeal. And I feel like I was kind of moving along with this, and this was kind of working okay. I had a simple plan here. I had cool colors in the background. Maybe in this instance, though, we had warmer colors in the background because I got those greens, right? So the main thing that was the focus was kind of all blue, and that was actually looking a bit cooler than some of the things in the background. And also I kind of realized that this was working, but it was feeling very kind of dark and not very sort of bright. And, I'm kind of adding more contrast to it, blocking in some contrast and sort of darker colors. And I was sort of deciding maybe I'll just make this guy feel more physical. Again, this is concept art for a project I was working on. So I was kind of thinking about these things as I was doing it. But yeah, what I kind of decided to do was go back and try and reassess the general kind of way that this image was working. And what I decided to do was increase the feeling of contrast through color, putting some bright red, right, making the character's red hat super bright, and really sort of bringing that to the foreground. So again, trying to lean into that logic and saying, I'm not getting the color vibrancy that I need for this image. This is meant to be high energy, like a high energy sort of children's, like younger reader style book, and I just wasn't getting that sort of color there. So I decided to increase the temperature change and just add some bright red. And then I kind of worked that through a little bit. We push things into the distance in the background, and yeah, we sort of get it working. And then this was kind of the finish, which I sort of shifted everything a bit towards the green, homogenized the image a little bit more. But yeah, this is kind of roughly what we sort of ended up with. So a pretty big kind of change, right, from here to here. And what I was using was just that basic understanding of like, I need some brightness here. I need to work the warm and cool contrast. It wasn't quite working. I had a blue character in the midground. So yeah, you often need to make these changes. And I think it's really important to understand that that's frequently the case. You have to understand your process and where you can do that. But often, again, what will happen is, we'll just be trying to work up an image like this, and it's kind of working, just add more and more and more, but that's not really going to give me the vibrancy I need, whereas this sort of gave me what I wanted. From the same series, this one's just in the same folder, so I thought it would be a good one to kind of share. I've got another image that has exactly the same kind of process for it. And this is typically how I will work. A lot of what we're doing in the beginning is building the image, thinking about the basics of it. So for this one, I started thinking of a tonal layout, right? This is a very different process to what I normally sort of share on the channel, but again, let me know if you want to see me, do some demos in this kind of style. I don't really use this for a lot of projects. I'm more into the line and color style, but you're starting and you're thinking about things that are important in the beginning. So I did a slightly more detailed kind of rough in there, and then I sort of added color. And often in the beginning, what you're trying to do is just kind of get the color in there, especially if you're working in a more painted style, because we're sort of building things up, and often we are going to, especially digitally, be able to, in the end, kind of adjust and tweak the contrast there. So again, I'm sort of building this up, sort of working on it, and here I was adding more detail, right? So add more detail, painted it up a little bit more, added some stuff, and added some more detail. But I think this is often what happens, right? Is I was adding more detail, I'm like, oh, this looks better, right? It's working better, but there's still not enough contrast there, and I'm not really feeling the distance, and I wanted it to feel as if he's like high above looking down. So what I did is add some color tweaks here, just using, again, basic color theory. What did I do? I made the characters in the sort of foreground, or essentially they're probably in the midground, really. I made them warmer, right? You can see, right? Everything was kind of a little bit yellow. It was all kind of, because it was built up from the same base, it was all looking very, very samey. So what did I do? I'm like, okay, let's make this character more red, right? I'll keep the greens there. Greens are there. I made them a little bit more vibrant. And then I really pushed the sort of temperature back in the background. Now, this is important because often what happens is you kind of can't, it may be tricky for me to make the green any greener. I'm like, I want the green to be greener, but then if I'm sort of at this stage, it's starting to be more warm and more, it's going to draw the eye more than some of the other colors in there. So again, increasing and introducing some simple color contrast, and then at the end I did a simple sort of adjustment on some of those values. Yeah, this kind of allowed me to get the image that I sort of needed. Still super rough kind of image, done quite a while ago. Wow, like sort of almost 10 years ago. Yeah, but it's a good example of how, as we're progressing through an image, we can just kind of think about it and, try and just apply these logical rules. When I'm painting, as you see with this process, this is typically when I apply it. I'm building up the image when I'm painting. At some point, I'm like, okay, I kind of build in contrast. I had a plan, but I need to sort of dial it up, right? Get the warm, cool contrast working. Here's another one. Again, same series. I feel like these are actually a pretty good example of this. These and this one actually I never finished, right? I never really sort of took it anywhere. But again, this shows me sort of struggling again with this same sort of concept. So I sort of start with a sketch. Got the same little character. He's got his big sort of, I forget what I was calling these things, but his big sort of rider beast there. And the idea is they're kind of hanging out in this sort of treetop forest. So that's what this concept image was about. And then I basically do a tonal pass, sort of painting a little bit and painting some of those midtones in there, and then I'm colorizing it. And so often, again, depending on the way your process works, this is typically what I would find is that through colorizing it, I would be trying to create a warmer base to work from, because again, we're creating more of a sepia base, and this tends to warm up all those grays that were created with the sort of more black and white tonal painting to begin with. And this is often what's happening is we're starting with a particular tonal color as an underpainting, and you then need to kind of build off from that, and then at some point you are then going to need to adjust your warm and cools based on that. This will give you a fundamental warm and cool contrast between the highlights and shadows. This is often why people start with a tonal sepia underpainting, because it means when you paint cools on top, you get a natural vibrancy. Even though people often paint over the whole thing, it just gives you that little bit extra sort of color pop. And yeah, but you can see here, I was trying to sort of push, again, these same ideas, right? So here I've got this, and I'm not really getting, the image is not really well organized. So I'm trying to organize it a little bit better, just from a color standpoint, pushing the stuff in the background back. And here we go, trying to sort of pull the stuff in the foreground. And yeah, trying to push, how far did I go with it? Yeah. So there we go. So you can see again, this is kind of working okay, but when I really sort of push that stuff in the background further back with some sort of blues and cools, and then what I do is try and add a little bit more detail in the foreground, and sort of try and play up the red right there. So again, just trying to make images that work. This is concept art. These are done very quickly. I'm just kind of throwing stuff together. So often in that case, what you need is simple, reliable processes, simple, reliable plans, and ways that you will be able to make an image always work. Again, this one obviously didn't work as much as I like, because I never kind of posted it. Here we got one last one from this series, and I think this is also a good example. I did a little pencil sketch in a sketchbook, scanned it in, and then I kind of started to try and block in some of these colors. And this has you know, what I've said is not a good idea to do. I've got a bright yellow background. It's not working. It's pulling all the contrast from the characters. And yeah, but this often does happen because we're trying to sort of get things looking vibrant. Often you'll just do some passes to kind of push things up, get things looking sort of warmer. I want to always kind of try and stay away from things looking, you know, sort of too gray. But yeah, this was not working. So again, I step back and I say, okay, what's wrong? Let's go with a simple plan, right? I need to make the background way cooler, right? So that's what I did. And, you know, I kind of took a lot of the temperature out of the main characters as well. We got some sort of fill light, right? Some blues hitting the top of them. And yeah, you know, the next step that I did, I think I moved this character, I put him there, and then I kind of dialed up the contrast. But probably this one, again, if I was to, this is another one where, you know, I didn't really post it that much. Yeah, I feel like it's suffering from that thing where there's a little bit too much saturation. I'm trying to dial up the saturation, dial up the contrast, add more shininess to it. It's still not really reading as well as I'd like. And I think if I'd paid more attention to warm and cool contrast between background, foreground, that would allowed me to create more contrast without adding so much sort of value contrast and trying to sort of shine it up, just add a whole bunch of details. And just lastly, looking at how we can incorporate a lot of these ideas into our basic plan and looking at how, you know, it's important to look at the sophistication of how these rules might apply. This is from a tutorial that's on the channel, and you know, we kind of step through the entire process. So if you want to check that out, if you haven't already, go check that out. It's sort of a 4-part tutorial, and this is kind of the finished image that we end up with. And it was kind of a faux cover. This was the pencil sketch, and what I did was work on the color thumbnail. And I'm thinking about warm and cool, simple plans from the beginning. The main character, yellow cape, right? Yellow cloak, that's going to come to the fore. I've also got a lot of blue in the background, i.e. cooler colors in the background behind her. But then I also have some cool hue, blue flowers and things that are in the foreground. Now, these feel very vibrant, but still the yellow is the thing that is going to draw the eye. So again, you can think about this on multiple levels where I want something to maybe be vibrant, but I don't want it to overpower something else. If these flowers had been red, they would have drawn a lot more of the eye, and they still would have been vibrant, but they would have drawn a lot more of the eye than you know, if they were sort of blue. So you can play around with color in many, many different ways. Right here I did the construction drawing, finish lines, and this is kind of how, yeah, there we go. That's kind of what we ended up with. And you know, it's just important to understand there's these things aren't hard and fast rules. They're just ways for you to understand it. But the fundamental thing is that the warmer color is going to come forward. It's going to be the thing that draws your eye. And if you just keep that in mind, it's very easy to play around and say, well, I'm going to have cool colors in the foreground, but they're going to be saturated. So they're going to make it feel colorful and like there's a lot of sort of stuff happening. This is often what you need in a simple image. This is just a character sitting in a forest. It's pretty boring, to be honest. It's a pretty dull image. Not a lot of story there, not a lot of drama. Typical kind of, you know, dramatic, you know, undramatic sort of pin-up style cover. But, you know, if I add a lot of color interest, there's going to be enough there that maybe people are going to, you know, think something interesting is going on. All right, lastly, back in Photoshop, what I want to do is just look at in a little bit more detail the idea of how you actually go about picking colors or adjusting colors and tweaking things that are already there. A lot of this is a matter of, as I said, planning it and thinking about what colors you want in different scenarios. Again, you know, if we look at this image, this actually has, right, if we go back and look at our eyedropper, right, this actually has some colors which are in the blue range, right? This is actually going there. So very sort of toned down. It's meant to feel like an attic, like it's dusty, like it's a little bit depressing, and the world that this character would travel into. I think that there was a basic, you know, sort of 80s board game in the attic sort of vibe to this video game that we had as a concept, and we're sort of trying to play that up. So the idea is you're often in an attic, it's kind of all gray and mushy, and then you enter the world, and that's sort of really exciting and colorful and vibrant. So this had to be sort of dull, and what I did is, you know, just tried to play up the warmth contrast in the sort of light versus in the shadows. So the shadows are often cool, and they actually do kind of start to hit gray, right, sort of greeny blue over here, And again, everything in the highlights is kind of warm. So obviously, again, many different ways to make an image work. How do you actually go about picking colors though? So this is where you have to think about, as I was saying with those blue flowers, right? Like, how do I get temperature contrast? How do I get warm, cool contrast? How do I use these ideas to create interest? Now, you don't want too much interest, and this is often what people have, is that they kind of say, like, oh, I need to paint, the background, and the background is blue, right? I need to make it, we need to make it sort of blue and cool, right? So we're putting sky blue in the background. It's like not quite. We need to be more subtle than that. And often, again, in order to try and get more vibrancy, we put too much in there. What is going to draw the eye is the vibrancy, the vibration between warm and cool colors next to each other. That is the interesting thing. The warm color comes forward, but it is the color vibrancy and the change that really makes the difference. So that's often what we're trying to get. That's why I think this page works, because we're leaning into those ideas. So in Photoshop, you can change these colors in a variety of ways. Let's look at, in a little bit more detail, the concept of doing it with the sliders, and then I'll look at some selections and things you can do in that instance as well. Again, I will unpack this in some actual demos, showing you from start to finish how I would sort of do this, talking through the color. Again, there's plenty of real-time videos where I'm coloring things, but often, again, I'm not talking you through exactly what's happening in my mind as it relates to the color or as it relates to temperature. But you can have just a color here. So the key is that often when we're picking colors and we're playing around with things, we're dealing with relativity. You often already have a color there. The first thing you kind of often want to do when you're painting something, and this is exactly what I do, is I sort of block in some color. And then what I'm often doing is adjusting the sort of relative temperature of those things. But, when we get to, putting in all the different colors for someone's costume or whatever, often what you're doing is, again, if it's not a comic where I have predefined colors for that, often what you're doing is you already have a color. You already have something that's there as a base. How do we sort of move it and make it warmer or cooler? So this is where you can use a mixture of saturation, brightness, and hue to kind of get the effect you want. And I'll describe why I think that is really important as we sort of go. So the reason that we want to use all of them, and I'll show you what I mean there, is that, right, if I have a red here, and let's make this a little bit more, right, a little bit more of a, right, sort of a medium red. So if I say, oh, I want a color that is cooler than this, I'm just going to decrease the saturation, right? And there we go. Boom. I now have a cooler red. If I say I want a darker red that's also cooler, I can decrease the saturation and the brightness, right? If I want to say, oh, I want it to be darker and cooler still, right? That's what I do. If you say, well, I want it to be brighter, more saturated, sort of warmer, right? Let's just increase the saturation. Now, you're not going to see much of that saturation, but if I sort of increase saturation and brightness, then we're seeing more of that color. There's less black in there, less toning it down, right? And I can sort of keep going. But at some point, you kind of hit a saturation level. It's as bright as it can go, right? That's almost the case in this cover. These reds and oranges are, and yellows are as bright really as they can go. So often what you may need to do is use a combination of hue shift as well. So for instance, here I have a bright yellow. And if I say, okay, let's make this less saturated, right? I'm going to dial back the saturation and the brightness, or the balance, or the black, or whatever you want to call it. Right? Boom. Easy. Right? I can drastically, make a real sort of gray here as well. Real cool version of this color. Easy. All right, I want a more saturated version of it. Nothing I can do, right? I'm like, well, that slider's all the way there. I'm all the way in the corner. I can't make a warmer version of this. Except I can now use the concept of hue. So if we think about the hue here as being, right, all along the warm side on this side of the color wheel, I can move it more towards this apex, right, which is the red. And you could probably say, again, I don't know whether this is theoretically right, but red is like the brightest, warmest color, right? The warmest of the hues. But I could move it a little bit more red. And now this is going to feel more saturated. It's going to feel warmer because I've moved it from a hue standpoint more towards there. Now, if you have like bright red, right, you're just completely there, and you want to make a warmer color than this, like I don't know what else you can do. But again, what I might be able to do is just shift the temperature a little bit, right, and say like it's kind of like a little bit feels a little bit brighter, but yeah, probably bright pure red out of the tube. That's it. So what this means is typically when you're working up your image, you do want to give yourself a little bit of headroom. And that is to say, even if you're doing flat color, I always want to leave myself a little bit of room so that I can sort of push things up. So often when we're working digitally, we have the ability to brighten things up quite a bit. And it does make sense in the beginning to stay, right, instead of just putting that one in, right? If I just kind of say, oh, I want a really bright orange. Let's paint in a really bright orange, right? This is, a very, very bright, very, very bright orangey color. And that means, if I need to make this more saturated, right, I can. If I need to make it a little bit lighter, I can. If I need to make it a little bit more sort of less saturated, sort of cooler, right, I can. And, I've got a lot of room to play there. I can really sort of max it out and I go like, let's make it even warmer. So, staying a little bit there, not going all the way to white, not going all the way to black is really good. It gives you a little bit more room to kind of push and pull right at the end. But this is fundamentally what you're doing. I'm picking one color, I'm picking a blue, and I'm saying, let's make a cooler version of this blue. All right, mix some gray in there. Boom, right, done. That's mostly what you're doing when it comes to mixing the colors via the sliders. Often though, you can use the color adjustment. So I could select one of these, Control U, and this will give me hue saturation. Hue saturation is a really good way to do this. The other way you can get that to this is image mode, adjustments, hue saturation. I don't ever do it this way. I use the shortcut Control U. But yeah, so here I can change the hue of that. I can change the saturation, right? And I can say, let's make this a little bit more saturated, right? A little bit more, right? A little bit warmer, right? And there we go. And the thing is that this sort of way of doing it, right? You might say, let's put the shadow in here of this, right? Let's just make it a little bit darker, a little bit less saturated. Again, that's not actually how you would pick the color for the shadow. There's probably a lot more theory there, but that's the idea. You can adjust the colors here, but you can also do this with selections in Photoshop, and this is often how right at the end, I could maybe sort of select, right? If I do, maybe let's do selective color, and then let's do select. This is often how I sort of like to do this, sort of color range, right? And let's select, all that kind of reddy orange there. So now what I'm doing is, just using the selective color. I could also do this with hue saturation, right? Move that mask, boom. And now I can say, well, let's change the hue of these. I want these to be cooler. Let's sort of reduce the saturation, right? Maybe, maybe I want the image to look a bit different. Right, maybe I want them to be more red. Right, do I want them to come forward? Right, if I really want them to come forward, we could make them, pure red. Right, bright red. That's like a different look. That's kind of cool. It's probably a better, more striking image than what was there before. Right. Yeah. But again, it needed to be yellow, right? Because that's the color it was. But yeah, so you can do that. You can tweak. You can tweak with selections. You can grab it with the magic wand, color range selection, a huge variety of ways in Photoshop and all digital art programs. Although I think this is where Photoshop has an edge still. Adobe's sort of selection tools and a lot of the AI tech they use for selections is pretty good. So you tend to get a better result when you're like, I want to pick this color. It's very good at doing that. most digital art programs will allow you to do that to a certain degree. Photoshop is really, really good. And once I've done that, again, just hue saturation, right? That gives me the same kind of sliders here. You can see saturation, lightness, hue, right? That's going to give me exactly the same control. And then I can kind of play around with that. So anyway, I'll save talking more through this to, I do some other sort of demos and things like that. But hopefully this gives you a good idea for how you would actually go in there, and both with the sliders, the selection tools, adjustment layers, etc., modify the temperature of your colors to increase their perceived contrast versus all the other colors in your image. Okay, phew, that was a lot of fairly in-depth, detailed color nerdery as it relates to warm and cool temperature changes and how that relates to art. Hopefully this was interesting though. This went on a lot longer than I expected, but hopefully I've been able to give you enough information here to really sort of get a handle on this topic. But as I said, I've got a couple more videos on the topic of warm and cool colors coming up over the next few weeks in the future. So stay tuned for those, but if you haven't already, check out this video, which goes over how to create simple color plans, and it unpacks a lot of very simple color theory too.